Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Catherine Perez-Estolano. I'd like to invite my colleagues up here. And we're getting a lot of echo chamber here, so we're going to do our best to maybe guys, oh, hi. Are we updating batteries? Okay. Why don't you come over this way, guys? I'm going to change around, or am I supposed to sit somewhere? Thank you so much. So this panel is very interesting to actually hear the previous panel. I just became an EV owner myself, I should say my wife did, and I now understand charge anxiety. It's actually now a medical term because we had that this week, and it's kind of it needs to be addressed. So it's a real thing, and I'm gonna make sure that we don't suffer from that too long here in LA. But again, thank you so much for participating and attending this panel. It's been a great conference so far, so congratulations to John and the entire CoMotion team for putting it together. This is the blueprints of the multimodal city. We have a fantastic group of folks here. Dick Alexander, who's the Executive Vice President of Business Development and Innovation from TransDev. Russ Brooks, who is the Smart Cities Director for Transport for America. And then GibranHadj-Chikh, Vice President of Strategic Transformation and Innovation from Parsons, and Justin Holmes, who's the Director of Corporate Communications and Public Policy for Zipcar. I'm not going to go into their bios. We have an hour, and in our prep call, we took over an hour, so I'm just not going to do all that. And you can Google and look at the book, but we have lots of things to go through, and certainly the conversations from the previous panel and other conversations have teed this discussion up. And I'm going to use the perspective of Los Angeles because that's kind of my petri dish. And so the first thing I'd like to ask the panel, and we just kind of want to take it first, whoever'd like to hit it. Multimodal city. Sounds really good. It's actually pretty messy at the end of the day. And here in LA County, we have had a bunch of messiness happen, particularly with the introduction of scooters and other modes that, you know, are, as Joshua Shank mentioned, are dropped into communities. So what we want to do is we want to understand, like, how do we address the messiness factor? And so, because what we want to do is make sure it's safe, make sure it's reliable, accessible, and all those things. But it's not so pretty watching the sausage being made. So maybe does somebody want to take a question? It's like, how do we really think about, like, making this happen without so much disruption, frankly, in our neighborhoods?
I'm happy to start. I think for us at Zipcar, we've been in business for 18 years now, and so we were among, I think, a very early set of companies that understood the future of mobility was really in paying for the trip and not the car. I think we're still in the middle of this story, right? So I think you're absolutely right that there is a fair bit of messiness today. But I think what's happening is you're seeing an incredible amount of new options emerge for consumers that are solving for use cases that people have historically relied on for the personally owned vehicle, right? And I think what we'll see over the course of the next couple of months and couple of years is that a lot of that behavior will begin to normalize, just as Zipcar 18 years ago seemed like a very crazy concept. That's what people thought about us, right? We were around 7 years before the iPhone was invented. And I think what you'll begin to see emerge is players that are successful in this landscape will really figure out how to partner with cities.
Justin, what do you mean by successful? Is it working with the public, local, agencies, the cities, or when you say success, just what does that look like? Because Zipcar has been around for a while, but it didn't solve for the first last mile. I mean, there's other things that might, but it is solving for maybe the last 10 miles or something. It's that gap closure. So when you say successful, what does that mean?
I think success means a lot of different things. Certainly for commercial enterprises, success looks like profitability and scale, right? I think for companies like ours that take a long view, success looks like fitting in well with a multimodal ecosystem that is driven in large part by a deep understanding of what a city's goals are, right? When we talk to our public partners tell us that they're concerned about congestion, they're concerned about sustainability, they're concerned about the use of curb space that really aligns with some of their goals.
We're going to talk about curbs because that's the new word for plastic is curbs, but let's go ahead and get to Gibran on the idea.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm with Parsons, and we've been in the business of delivering transportation infrastructure for 75 years. And the thing we've seen is that multimodalism is nothing new, and it's something that we have a lot of clients who are wrestling with how to transform their legacy systems. Like the example of in DC, when they connected the Red Line to Union Station, no one thought that people would be commuting from Baltimore. No one thought that there would be people commuting to New York via Acela. And so it does really give you some parameters to think about when you're looking at a facility design as to, all right, how are we bringing people? How many are we allowing by vehicle, by large size, by small size? How do we make sure that we still maintain this granularity? How do we make sure there's still equity and access? So our perspective is that you have to start looking at when you begin planning your system and starting to look more towards performance specifications rather than just traditional engineering parameters.
Well, let's get to Russ. There's got to be the shining star of the Portland of transportation somewhere out there, like the example. Is there somebody, some city on the globe that has done this well, multimodal integration, and done it well?
Well, I mean, I think it's a moving target, right? Every 6 months we seem to have some new modal option that fits into our cities, and I think the cities that are doing it well are the ones that, just like Justin said, that are really clear about what their goals are, what their outcomes are, and what kind of city they want to be. And they are working to create the regulatory framework to put up the boundaries or the bumpers for those new services to operate in a way that ensures or at least leads them towards their long-term goals. I think Seattle's creation of the bike share permitting process last year was revolutionary for cities, and they did two things. They, one, created a permit process that said these are the things that are important for us and these are the things that we want these services to help us accomplish. But two, they coupled it with their new mobility playbook, which was their set of values and principles that said, we don't really know how all this stuff is going to shake out, but what we're going to do is we're going to tell you how we're going to approach this and what are the things that are important to us and what are the things that we're going to be on the lookout that could be risk factors or consequences that may come from that. That, to me, was a huge leap forward for cities.
Well, and Dick, what is TransDev in all of this? Like, we're going to talk a little bit about the role that the public, private, and nonprofit, but how does TransDev participate in the conversation about, successful multimodal design?
So as a company, we're a multimodal provider of services. So we operate everything from buses, paratransit, ferries, autonomous vehicles, you name it, if it moves people, we're in that business. Hello, that's better. So as I was saying, so TransDev is a multimodal provider of services. So we provide everything from buses, paratransit, shuttles, BRTs, autonomous vehicles, ferries, rail systems. So we're in the business of moving people, and so we're in the urban space, and that connectivity amongst all those modes is kind of what we do. What we've really tried to do of late, though, is kind of see, okay, what's the next step down the road? And so we've created, for example, in Babcock Ranch in South Florida, what we think is maybe kind of our living lab to say, how does all this fit together? How do you take the goal of the community? Babcock Ranch, for those that are unfamiliar with it, is a new city, be about 85,000 residents when it's done. Its goal is to be sustainable, so it's a 100% solar-powered community. It is trying to adopt an environment that will please people, a livable city. And so some of their goals are, we don't want congestion, we don't want people to own 2, 3, 4 cars. We wanted to make it a true city, so it's not a retirement village. They have an incubator called a hatchery. They have a medical facility, schools. It's a full community. But what we're doing there is trying different forms of transportation. It's kind of our way in an unmessy environment to see what works and
Yeah.
what doesn't work.
See, Dick, this is the thing, is that if I had a tabula rasa and a city that had nothing there, I could design a really cool, functioning, fully high-performing city, but that's not how we work.
But you don't know if it really works. And does the user really want to use autonomous shuttles? Do they really want to give up their cars? Do they really want an environment? Yeah, maybe.
No, they don't.
But I think what we're doing there is trying to understand those dynamics.
Yeah.
You know, what are the pricing dynamics? What are people willing to pay
Yeah.
for that kind of an environment? And it's kind of our playground to some degree to figure some of those things out, apply those lessons learned then in an urban environment as we're going into it.
Well,
Urban cities.
no, I think, you know, Seattle, I think the other ones that Russ had mentioned, I think those are great examples. One of the things that has come up, and Salida Reynolds is kind of leading the charge, Metro, to their credit, is looking at gender diversity and gender-minded planning. When we're thinking of multimodal communities, I'm always cognizant of where the the understanding of gender decision-making in transportation choice-making, as well as ethnic and racial differences and perspectives when making decisions about using alternative modes. And Regina couldn't join this panel. She was moved on to an earlier panel, so I lost my colleague on the female side here on my panel. But I'd like this panel to answer the question, you know, gender and racial diversity has got to be part of the overall planning and strategy in rolling out these programs. And I will tell you that Salida is, if you probably have heard Salida, I think she was on some panels yesterday, she's fierce about this. She's like, you know, we've been planning for 30-year-old white men for transit forever. And if you think about the way to get to a bus stop, you think about the way to get to a train stop, you think about the lighting and the access, it is a kind of test route for women or people with children or people with disabilities or seniors and folks who have conditions where, you know, they need light, they need things to help them find their way. So I just want to ask you, how are you guys thinking about these in this multimodal, multi-generational, multi-diverse communities? Well, okay, go ahead, Dick.
You know, I think it starts with accessibility. It starts with safety. And I mean accessibility in the sense not necessarily because of disability, it's just providing the diversity of modes that lets people access transportation based on their own abilities.
Dick, are people in your operation reflective of gender diversity and ethnic diversity? That's what we're looking for, is the perspective that actually creates the sensitivity and understanding in the conversation. I know you and everybody, when we talked about this, and Russ, we had mentioned that there were some good examples in other places about things that are trying, but I'm just kind of trying to force the issue. This is a big problem. It's a gap. And so we as professionals are like, yeah, let's make it accessible, let's make it equitable. But I want to know that there's people in your shop and people in everybody's operations that are really reflective of those decisions. Just kind of putting you on the spot, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think in our organization, is, you know, our workforce, the people that work for us are representative of the community we live in. And that means gender, it means race, it means age, it means all those, ability, disability. I think it's critical, at least from a private sector perspective, that we reflect the community we serve. And we are very conscious about that and make an effort towards that and making sure that we have that diversity.
Mm-hmm. Gibran?
Well, at Parsons, diversity is one of our core values, and we take that very seriously. And as our Director of Innovation, I strongly believe that you do not get innovation without diversity, that if you do not have everyone in the room to understand how they think, what they use day to day, have those basic conversations, you're not running the sanity check you need to be responsive to your community. Like, I had the opportunity early in my career to work in our office in Dubai, and I loved working there simply because we had people representing everywhere in the world. Our Chicago office is the same way. The folks we have supporting positive train control. We have wonderful diversity by ethnicity, by gender, by age, and so you are getting every perspective as to how this is affecting people.
And how about you? Sorry.
For us, I am so proud to work for a company that was founded by 2 female entrepreneurs in Cambridge and has been led by 2 consecutive female CEOs. For us, we could always do more, right? But we work incredibly hard to ensure that the folks that are designing the services that we provide reflect the diversity of our community. The other thing I'll say is, you know, Zipcar is commonly seen as among a set of tech or mobility companies that are designed for sort of upwardly mobile millennials who want to live a very altruistic, sort of low-car lifestyle. And for us, what we've learned is there's actually a significant market for people who cannot afford access to a vehicle and for whom we are providing access, affordably so, to an incredibly valuable mobility service. And our ability to do that is much faster and much better when we work with government. We're working with New York City today on a project to provide access to car sharing for residents of New York City Housing Authority development. So in 11 NYCHA properties today, you'll find Zipcar located directly in the facility, directly outside the facility, to try to help close gaps to grocery stores or to try to provide transportation to folks who might need it to get to a job interview. We are incredibly proud of that commitment, but even more so, incredibly proud of the way we've been able to work collaboratively with cities to try to solve that
Well,
challenge.
you mean 52% of our population are women. So it's in your best interest to actually include and have them participate at the highest levels in designing these programs and systems, because I think that they kind of understand what are the inherent challenges to using, buying, and taking advantage of these things. Russ, are there some good examples? Because I know Stephanie Wiggins, who is Phil Washington's deputy, she is heading up a gender task force. Like, I forget what Stephanie called it, but it's essentially within Metro a gender sensitivity effort to get Metro to understand what are those issues within Metro to improve their planning, design, and implementation. But are there some good examples, Russ?
I mean, I think LA Metro is a really good example in the work that Phil Washington's doing. They're creating, or in the process of creating, a transportation and technology secondary school, right, in a low-income community as a way to drive that process from the ground up. I mean, obviously, Salita, I think, has made that a big part of her mission as she directs LADOT, but I think you see places like Pittsburgh that their view, Karina and the mayor's view of all of this smart mobility is, if it's not for all of us, it's not for us. So they're starting from a very holistic place, and I think one of the challenges that cities have to confront is how exactly do they do that? How do they make these technologies work for everybody? But secondly, we just wrote something in our organization a couple of weeks ago about there's a lot of marketing about how these new services are really all about equity and all about access, and these pilot projects that cities are taking on are about creating first mile, last mile access, and if you actually look at the design of the program, they're not targeted at that. It's a great marketing point, but if you look at the scope and the structure of how the pilots are run, of what they're targeted at, they're really not. There are very few examples. Detroit in their Woodwork to Work program, from the beginning and from the ground up, it was about how do we create access for low-income workers to get to service jobs. In TD Late Shift in Pinellas County, Florida, it was the exact same thing. How do we provide a greater level of access from 10 p.m. at night to 6 o'clock in the morning when our transit system shuts down? And so there are a lot of cities that are talking about this is great for equity and this is great for access, but if you actually look at how their programs and their projects are designed, they're not.
Well, and I think that's the question, is that our people are talking about it, and I'm just tired of talking about it. It's so painfully obvious to me that users of various perspectives need to be part of the decision-making process, and that point of view is vital to actually having a successful system. So
Well, I would also say that I think paratransit offers a wonderful model for us to learn from. When we create systems that work for the most vulnerable among us, they work really well for everybody else.
Exactly what Salita said. She says if we design for the most vulnerable, we got it. but we're not doing that. That's my point, is we're not getting there yet.
Yeah, I think the last thing I would just say is I think I would go back to what you said about it starts with hiring in our cities. It starts with hiring in our departments. There are wonderful leaders around this country. We mentioned Salida, we mentioned Phil Washington. There's people like Karina Ricks and Robin Hutchinson in Minneapolis, Leah Treat, who just left Portland, that are putting at the top of their priorities to change the way that we approach transportation internally as a city and in the culture of how we approach it, but also externally in the people that we serve.
Well, and just to be clear, we're darn lucky here in LA because we got a lot of good perspectives and I think real trailblazers when it comes to that in running our agencies. Gibran?
Well, I think part of it, when we talk about serving diverse communities, a lot of the conversations I've been part of today, we've been talking about data and the need to understand your client, and that goes to community outreach. That when we're planning public facilities, the traditional way is to do physical outreach, but when you look at the folks we're trying to serve, they're the folks who have the least amount of time available to attend that meeting because they're working 2 jobs, because they're already dependent on a transit system. So I think there's definitely a page we can steal from a lot of the ride shares and from the other tech communities to start developing this feedback cycle with our constituents, with our passengers, with the people that we're serving, so they have a much better way of letting us know what they need, and we can respond to that.
Well, and this gets back to the inclusive design, right? So this is, and Dick, to your point, you know, the example that you gave to us, which I think is super exciting, you know, having this opportunity to kind of design from the raw template. But how do you think about inclusive design in a multimodal context when it comes to equitability, when it comes to clean, when it comes to active transit? You're pulling all the pieces together and just kind of helping understand where you and TransDev is thinking about when it comes to that inclusive design piece.
You know, I think a lot of it comes down to what you were saying. It's the involvement of the users of the system in the design of the system. And you know, I think of as an example what we're doing in New Orleans now, where we've just put together a strategic plan that involved, I don't know, 120 some community meetings of all sizes, shapes, hours of day, methods of contact, whether it be in person, through surveying, through social media. But out of that came ideas such as for example, in New Orleans, one of the problems they have is that it's a 24-hour city, but they don't have a 24-hour transportation system. So people get off work at 3 in the morning from hotels, bars. They have a lot of cash on hand because they're tips, waiters, and the concern is safety. How do I get home safely, and do I really feel safe walking down the street with literally hundreds of dollars of cash in their hand? And so we've designed, and hopefully be putting in shortly, almost a microtransit system that picks them up either through a phone call or an app and gets them door to door safely at 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. And it's really kind of designing systems like that that are meeting very specific needs as defined by the users of the system.
That's great, and I'm glad to hear you got to share that example in New Orleans. I guess that's a good beta test. That would be great to know how successful that idea is in helping, you know, different parts of our economic workforce actually have alternative means to getting home after a long day. The thing I do want to talk about, because it was brought up in the narrative for this session, was curbs. I never thought about curbs as being really, I didn't think about curbs as a transit planner, but darn, they're hot now. And they want to price them, and they want to color them, and they want to make sure that every time you step on a curb, you pay a fee. I'm all for that, because I think what's happened is, and Joshua Shank from Metro said it best, you know, if the private sector is going to use the public realm, then you should support the public realm in terms of a fee or something like that. And we're talking really about deliveries, we're talking about you know, TNCs and other things like that. I have seen San Francisco I guess they're modeling out digitalization of the streets, corridors within the city, and they're figuring out just what is a peak period for curb usage, and they're going to start charging and doing some district curb management programs. I'm super excited about it because I think what it does is it gives the city some control over who's using the curb, how long. We used to do it with parking meters, but that seems like with digitalization, that's passé. So what do we think about the curb? It's the new hot, where are we going to be? Are we going to be at something else in 6 months or a year? But what do we do about the curb? Gibran.
Concrete is tech agnostic. It's, in many cities, the same piece of concrete that's been there for 100 years, 200 years. And we have to adapt our strategies as to how we manage that. That if you want to move 300 people in 10 minutes, give me 3 buses and 40 feet of concrete. If you want everyone to go to a ride share, you can't use that same 40 feet for 280 vehicles unless you start to build in other systems and other capabilities. So we really do have to rethink how we're using this. Because we look at what happened when the automobile came. We started destroying our main streets. We started destroying communities to accommodate them for parking. And we don't want to go through that experience again. So we really have to think about the granularity of data, who's actually in charge of that curb, and how are we handling those transactions. So maybe you're no longer parking by the hour, maybe you're paying by the second, depending on how long.
It's by the second. And Justin, this would hit, like Zipcar, you guys, I mean, where are you in this conversation about curb management?
Yeah, for us, I mean, we fully understand that the curb is probably the most valuable asset that cities have to induce the kind of transportation goals that they want to achieve. We have a number of partnerships with cities who understand that car sharing, because the data that we've shared with cities is so valuable and proves that every vehicle we put on the road takes away the need for 13 personally owned cars. And our members, when they join Zipcar, drive less overall and use more sustainable modes of transportation. And because cities understand that, and because we have good relationships with them, they invest curb space in order to really prove and accelerate our growth in key areas around communities. We think that's an incredible start, but we all know that curbs are used in many cases for means of transportation or modes of transportation that are not aligned with those goals, right? The vast amount of curb space in this country is used for vehicle storage, right?
Well,
and it's not priced
right.
really to reflect the true cost
Right.
of providing that infrastructure. And those are the kinds of policy discussions that I think we need to have to make a meaningful impact on shifting toward a more multimodal lifestyle. Where the rubber really meets the road is politics, right? And where I think I come from a city in Boston where I'm pretty sure in the state constitution of Massachusetts, there is a God-given right to free parking. We had a little bit of snowfall yesterday, and people were already putting out their lawn chairs, holding their piece of earth, their piece of concrete in front of their house, because that's their parking spot, right? So I think one of the challenges that we really do need to overcome in order to think about more dynamic uses of curb space is really build a political constituency that can help provide the support to the great city leaders that Russ works with to really do and implement some more progressive public policies.
Well, here in LA, at UCLA, we have this professor called Dr. Donald Shoup, who is the
We're all
author
Shoupistas,
of
yeah.
The Free Cost of High Parking. And what I'm hoping is he does a compendium to it called The High Cost of Curbs and Free Curb Parking, because I think it is a very, it's kind of within that realm of like the public space and the trade-offs associated with that. But Russ, my thoughts are, how is it going to affect different socioeconomic groups? You know, people who are doing Uber or Lyft or whatever, or people who are, you know, just kind of doing their job, and then they're the ones that got sucked up into this curb pricing. And you know, I'm worried about different actors within our communities that are at risk of kind of being this regressiveness of it all. Yeah. Is there a way around this? What do we do about that?
Well, you know, just to build on the Donald Shoup, you know, he's got a collection of articles of all the confrontations and violence that has come through those conflicts at the curb. He literally pulls it out, and there's like, you know, person stabbed over parking spot in convenience store parking lot or whatever. I mean, just last week, Alec Baldwin got arrested in New York for punching someone over a parking space. So there is so much
That is
to
Alec
unpack.
Baldwin, though.
There is
Comes with the territory.
there's so much to unpack there, and I think cities are turning around to the idea that this can actually be a really effective tool for them to drive the outcomes that they want. Justin mentioned it, it's a really valuable piece of real estate, but it's also around there is this socialization of pricing something that typically we have thought about for free, and we do that with all the infrastructure. We don't think about our cost in using it on a minute-to-minute or a day-by-day basis. We just think, oh, it's $100 million for that bridge, but we can't actually translate that into our own personal behaviors. I think right now that cities are starting to think about this, and I think most of them are still making a mistake when they're thinking about it. They're still siloing the different use cases of the curb. They're not thinking about this, not all of them, but they're not thinking about it from an asset management standpoint and saying, okay, we've got 20 linear feet of curb space. What are all the things that need to use it? And instead, they're saying, okay, well, let's try and just work about TNCs, or let's do something with car sharing, or if they're really thinking about it, they might say, okay, let's talk about freight and urban delivery. But I don't know of anybody outside of a handful of places that are really thinking about everything holistically, and to think about the people who are going to get left behind or are going to get squeezed. There are going to be a lot of them if we're not thinking about everything at once and really attacking the whole universe of how we need to manage this space. But again, how we need to manage it in concert with our values and the goals that we set with ourselves as a city, and how we can use this as a tool to drive the outcomes and the behaviors that we really want to see in our communities.
Well, and Dick, to some of the transdev issues that you guys are kind of probably contemplating, I remember in many cities that I've worked in, the issue of parking, paying for your parking because there's a parking meter there, right? In Pasadena, it was hand-to-hand combat for a while because they started putting parking meters in old Pasadena to pay for the improvements and the alleys and things that are there now. But when it first came, people were having fistfights. It was terrible. So I understand, I mean, there is a real serious consideration about how cities roll out these programs and how they get people to really understand, like, well, where are these funds going to go to? It can't just go into the general fund and like pay for something. Things have to really be programmed to be thinking about how are people seeing the real value of what these things are, because I can see toll curbs coming around the corner. So Dick, how are you guys thinking about curbs?
I think one of the things that sometimes is lost in the discussion is really the productive use of the curb versus what mode has access to it. We kind of are on both sides of the fence in some of our operations. For example, in San Francisco, we operate public transit systems, buses there, and of course bus stops are very critical. You've got to have access to the curb. We're carrying mass transportation, a lot of people. We also run a lot of the Silicon Valley private buses. And in that case, we pay a fee for access to that curb. That's fine, but what isn't taken into consideration is that often a lot of those buses have 2, 3, 5 people on them. They're not, they can seat 40, but they don't have 40 people on them. And instead of pricing access to the curb, you'd be pricing the empty seats approaching that curb or empty seats using that vehicle so that you're getting productive use. I mean, a city is better off if you're carrying 40 people out of the community in a mass transit environment. You solve a lot of social ills as far as congestion and sustainability, all those issues. But if you're running those buses for 2, 3, 5 people, very different picture. So how do you drive through incentive, not necessarily a positive incentive, not a negative incentive, to say, private buses, how do you merge multiple trips to get the most productive use of that curb rather than each company doing their own thing with their own people, with their own number of people?
Yeah, I think there is a real question as to how we're going to divvy up. And I don't think it's just curbs. I think we're going to be looking at all kinds of different public spaces, even kind of looking at how we're using sidewalks and what does sidewalks mean. I'm not saying tax your sidewalks. I'm just thinking like there's a lot of competition. A lot of competition for these
With the
spaces.
scooter revolution, we're really seeing that.
Yes, yes, the scooters. I'm very familiar with the Santa Monica case study that is continuing to roll itself out. So, but you know what? I've talked to Santa Monica officials and I've said, please figure this out, because I do think that it is part of the solution and the options that are available to people. But it is public safety. There's a lot of issues, and I'm hoping that they continue to figure that out and be a good model for other cities to kind of figure it out, because it is messy right now. Before we get to maybe some of the questions, I do want to ask about autonomous vehicles. Friend of mine, Peter Calthorpe, who's an architect, he wrote a piece recently, or was interviewed, and he said autonomous vehicles are not going to get an end to congestion. I'm like, thank you, Peter. We know that it's not going to be an end to congestion. What are we thinking about autonomous vehicles in our multimodal communities and in our area, in our effort and anxious, energy to try and get to that place where people can choose what they want when they want it? Where does autonomous vehicles and the AV community fit within all of this? Because it's, I'm just trying to think of all the things that are right now in our streets and dropping these things in, having them fly above. I mean, it's not Blade Runner, but I'm kind of trying to figure out what we're heading toward. So maybe, Gibran, do you want to give it a shot?
Oh, I have a client that brought me in and they wanted to know, it's like, well, what do you think we should do about autonomous vehicles? And this particular client has a rubber tire people mover, so I pointed out, you already have one, and you've been running it for decades, but you haven't considered it. There are ways to design your systems and your facilities so you can incrementally add these things. So one perspective is that you no longer need to think about people movers or monorails. Build a guideway that can allow current autonomous vehicles to operate. That now gives you the flexibility that you're not locked into the entire system. You can swap out those vehicles as they get better. As you learn more about them, now when you're comfortable, you can introduce them to the streets, and that facility is still useful to you. That's your next High Line. That may still serve as a transportation facility. But there's ways that we can incrementally do it where it's not all or nothing. We just have to be more open in terms of how we look at procuring these things and defining the problem set.
Well, I think this whole conference has been about trying to understand where they fit, and maybe Justin, you can share with us how is Zipcar thinking about the AV community and like what's that next generation look for where you guys sit?
Yeah, I think for us we look at automation as really an enabling technology that could help us accelerate the growth of the kind of services that we've been offering for a very long time. I think if you look at autonomous technology in isolation, there could be an infinite amount of applications. The way we look at it is designing systems that are shared, automated, connected, and electric. And I think the combination of those technologies can really unlock a tremendous amount of new mobility and more sustainable ways to move in our cities. I think there's a fair amount of technology challenges to get us there, but I also think there's a fair amount of policy ones as well. I mean, to relate the discussion on curbs, I think cities are asking themselves, what is the highest and best use of curb space? And I think it's important to have that discussion now. It's going to be critical in an automated world, right? Automated vehicles, if they're deployed in an urban context, are not going to be permitted to stop just like your Uber or Lyft might today, mid-traffic to let people on and off. You're going to have ample amounts of curb space for safe landing zones or pickup and drop-off areas, right? That's a very different use of the curb than the curb usage that we think of today, and an incredibly powerful lever that cities can use to try to induce the kind of service designs that really are well aligned with their goals. So I think it might be premature to start think about what is the precise regulatory framework, because we're not exactly there yet, but it's certainly not too soon for cities to really think deeply, what are their transportation goals, and then what are the levers that they have access to really induce them. Right, and Russ, before you go, TransDev, you're kind of in this right now with so how are you thinking about this? Because that's like hits at the center of what your business model is, right?
Yeah, You know, first of all, autonomy is not a question of if, it's a question of when. And you see the billions that are being invested in it by a lot of big corporations, and it'll get to that point. The other thing to recognize is, in my mind, autonomy is going to change just the complete urban design of cities. When you no longer have to park a vehicle because that autonomous vehicle can drop you off, and even if it's your own personal autonomous vehicle, it can go back home and sit. It doesn't have to park on the street. It can go off-site, outside the urban area to sit. It's going to change the design of cities. It's going to change the economics of places like airports. You know, the percentage of revenue that's generated by parking garages in airports is really big. And if you no longer need to park your car when you go to the airport because that car can go home on its own without you, it's going to change the physical space. You're going to need more curb, less parking garages. You have a less need for parking garage that gives you more density to add more, you know, commercial or residential space in cities. That's going to create greater density, which will...
Dick, aren't we having more cars on the street all the time then? I mean, and they're also on electric, so they're needing energy, right?
It is. I think we will have more on the street unless we make the investment in mass transportation and truly create BRT, you know, high volume, high capacity modes of transportation that work for people.
Russ, help me see this. How is this gonna work?
So I tend to be more of a curmudgeon about this. I think it has been the biggest shiny object, fuzzy squirrel thing that has come across in transportation in forever. And I think it has led so many people in the wrong direction, but it has a lot of really positive benefits. I have a lot of cities that say, great, how should we prepare for autonomous? And I say, well, what are your goals as a city, right? That's always the first question. But the second one is, what are the new service models that are being created out of automation? And I don't actually see a lot. Yes, I know that there are sidewalk bots now, and I know that everybody keeps talking about drones, but as you think about surface transportation, there aren't really. There are freight, there are TNCs, there are personal ownership. So what I tell cities is just figure out how to deal with those service models today. If you want to figure out how to deal with an AV-TNC, figure out how to deal with a TNC. And once they remove the driver, it'll complete the loop. But it doesn't radically change the service model. It might make it better, faster, and cheaper. But the base core understanding of how we can deal with these services doesn't really change. And I think a lot of cities, unfortunately, are using this to justify not doing things that we know will help them reach their goals today. I have cities that say, well, why should I invest in transit anymore?
Why should
I invest in transit anymore? I have, I'm not going to need it anymore. Or, but on the flip side, there are cities that are saying, well, I don't want to build any more parking ramps, which I think is great, and hopefully those indicators already exist today without automation. But they're saying, okay, any parking ramp that gets built needs to be able to be converted to a multi-use facility, whatever that is. I think that's great. But the city of Summit, New Jersey, for example, decided that they didn't want to spend $10 million on a parking ramp to do park and ride at the rail station, the commuter rail station. That had nothing to do with automation. It had to do with the fact they didn't want to spend $10 million. So what did they do? They spent $200,000 a year in a partnership with Uber and Lyft to give first mile, last mile service to anybody who wanted to park there. And so what did they do? They got 40 years of that service in theory, which will degrade in time, the counting of it. But those are the kind of decisions that we should actually be making today, which are based on real world decisions, but are also based on what are the needs today in order to drive our long-term goals. And we're already struggling to deal with freight and urban delivery and curb management, dedicated transit lanes, protected spaces for active transportation. That is going to have so much more of an impact for us immediately than what an uncertain future looks like over the next 10, 20, or 30 years.
Go ahead,
I think, though, if I could add, I think where it does change the equation is the economics of transportation. If you have a bus which is 60 to 70% of your operating costs are tied up in labor in some form, either maintaining a diesel engine, driving the vehicle, and you can change the economics of public transportation, then it's a whole new game.
Sure, but I totally agree with that. But we need to learn how to deal with buses today. We need to learn how to deal with buses with drivers today. We need to give them dedicated spaces to run. We need to give them transit priority. We need to give them signal timing priority. And those things don't change in an automated future. That's more
true.
what I mean.
That's true.
But I think the hardest job right now in our world is being a transit agency. I think working for a transit agency has got to be one of the hardest jobs, because you're, the kind of don't build for tomorrow's attitude, which is like, rail or bus or something like that. Don't build for yesterday, build for tomorrow. And yet there's still these things, as Russ says, you still have to provide these systems and services for people to be able to have accessibility and affordable, clean options. So go ahead, Gibran.
Well, I kind of see it from the opposite perspective, which is I started my career with the transit agency in Tallahassee. And I think that's a very good representation of, you have a lot of smaller cities that are trying to run fixed route service because it's equitable and because that's providing options, but it's not cost effective for them. So autonomy, rideshare models, looking at new microtransit opportunities, it can really open up what a small city can do to expand.
I am so excited to hear that. I don't see small cities having the means and the resources to do that unless you're an affluent city that is small and can do that. And just in LA County, Gibran, there's like on one hand you can count that could do that.
Well, so Tallahassee right now has 100 buses. Their best service frequency during peak hour is 30 minutes. So right now, that's an opportunity for a public-private partnership. If you can bring in a microtransit partner that can be serving hubs, now you can take those same 100 buses, those same 100 drivers, which clearly the issues of labor are very critical and real. Now you can redirect that. So now instead of running 12 routes at 30 minutes, now you're running 4 at 10 or 15. And you're now actually able to provide even better service and better coverage than you can before. So I think the opportunity is there to work within budgets. And then over 5 years, as you're starting to depreciate a fleet and you're getting rid of your 40-footers, because now that's creating a delta in your CapEx and your OpEx that you can use to then expand the service.
I hope we get there. I hope we get there. Anybody have any questions for the panelists? Because we could just sit up here and Russ and I could push back on the guys all day long. But it's just, for me, and I work for an international engineering design consulting firm, and we do a lot of digital integrated transportation planning and design work. And one of the challenging things is, like, you're dealing with hardscape. You're dealing with stuff that doesn't move, and frankly, if it's a rail, it won't move for a really long time. So challenges about how do you be nimble, flexible, and evolutionary in delivering these systems, I think, is just challenging. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. I'm told we have 5 minutes.
Okay. I have a question. I'm over here.
Yes, go ahead.
So I'm on the city council in Boulder, Colorado, and we are a small, affluent city with transportation funding from a sales tax, so it's not going away. We have really aggressive energy goals, but still this fierce sort of protective attitude around the single occupancy vehicle, and tremendous challenges with almost anything that we do to try to increase other modes. At the same time, we're doing our transportation master plan update. We're hiring a new director, so it's a time that's ripe for some change. But I hear differing opinions among the panelists, but I would love to come home with, like, what are the top 2 or 3 or 5 things that you could advise policymakers on, from whether it's a zoning perspective, anything to kind of inch towards the future.
Well, and thank you very much for being here. I would say the second hardest job is being an elected official in a city, having to manage and oversee a transit agency that's delivering this stuff. So is there, Russ, top 5 bullets? Okay.
That's a loaded question, but I think cities need to figure out, as I've said before, what kind of city they want to be, and they need to align their policies with those values. But then they actually need to follow those policies. So if climate is your #1 goal and transportation is the biggest sector, what are you doing to encourage mode shift? Are you doubling down on transit and creating dedicated lanes? Are you creating more protected spaces for biking and walking? Are you fostering the conditions to get people out of their cars. Because if you look across all the cities that came out after the Climate Paris Agreement and after the government pulled out, and you actually looked at all their transportation policies, they don't line up with what they say. So that's the biggest thing, and a lot of cities will pass a policy around complete streets or a climate plan, but they don't actually then follow that plan, and they don't allow their practitioners. And it also means a shift in culture and a re-education and a training of the staff, because I'm guessing that transportation engineer number 3 or transportation planner number 3 grew up in an old school system with the Green Book and doesn't really understand how things are changing, but also hasn't been trained that way. Yeah. And that's at the state level and at the city level. So there's a pretty radical kind of reorganization and education.
I would add to that the political will and giving the staff the opportunity to make mistakes. I think that is the challenge too, is that sometimes, like this bar is so high and it's like, okay, if you city staff, you guys can make mistakes because we're the mayor and the council and we're going to back you and we're just going to give this a shot. I think that's also important to have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right, and I think we as advocates forget that the people who use these services that we are really bully on is a tiny percent of the population, that ride hailing is still only used by like 20% of people, that scooters is even a smaller proportion. I had a woman speak up at a panel that I was on and said, we've got scooters, can we get bike lanes now? And I was thinking, hopefully, but it doesn't actually mean that everybody is still aligned with that or that everybody agrees with that. And political support and public acceptance is a huge part of it.
It is. Justin?
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think from where we sit at Zipcar, thank you, from where we sit, some of the most effective ways that we've worked with cities have been through pilot programs. So if you talk about building up the political will, taking small incremental tests, whether it's a small program
projects.
with Zipcar where you're dedicating parking
Demonstration
in
projects.
one small area, right, will show consumers, will show residents that the sky didn't fall when we gave away 2 parking spaces in a neighborhood that has 10,000 of them, or when we do experiments with dedicated lanes for buses to travel in, right? We're seeing that happen in Boston and other cities where, these pop-up pilot projects actually prove to be really valuable and people love them, and then they turn into programs at scale. But you can mitigate your risks and build a lot of really goodwill by just testing things.
And I would just say anything that looks temporary, people kind of say, okay, it can go away, but then it gets poured in concrete and they're like, oh, I guess it'll stay. So I have seen that, that's people's ability to get used to things and then say, okay, well, that wasn't so bad. I know here we had to deal with traffic circles, but they started with cones. So then we got used to doing this like other parts of the world does so easily. I think we can take one last question, Olivia. And, that's it? Yes, sir. Your mic's not working, sir. Do you have a good big voice?
So, Rod from J-Ride, thanks. Question for Zipcar. Today, ride sharing, ride hailing versus car sharing, very different economic models. Fast forward, AV future, are they the same model? How do you think about that?
That's a great question. We do think about that a lot. We're testing an awful lot of services. For example, in London, a flex service that really helps us understand what are the dynamics of operating a car sharing service when you're not locked to a particular location where vehicles can float around a city, and what can we learn from the dynamics of a service that is slightly more on demand than our service today. I think you're right. I think there is a point in time when the service that we operate today as car sharing and services like ride hailing through Uber and Lyft begin to converge into a new type of mobility service. One of the things we think a lot about as one of our crown jewels or our capabilities that are really difficult to replicate is all the work that we do and have learned how to do in fleet management. Our parent company, Avis Budget Group, our CEO was here yesterday talking about a great partnership that they have with Waymo. If you think about an automated world, right, today the folks who bring vehicles and maintain vehicles and gas vehicles in a service like Uber or Lyft are the drivers, right? And in a world where the driver goes away, there's a whole set of capabilities that we're really going to need around fleet management, fleet ownership, fleet maintenance, fleet care, that we figured out how to do at Zipcar, both at some sizable scale, but also in a distributed capacity in cities. So we think that that's a potentially really key advantage for us as we move toward an automated future.
Well, I think.
Sorry, so you're saying
Maybe
that
we could. You
future
guys
land?
could speak after. That would be okay, because I've got Greg sitting here, and I'm not. So I just want to say thank you to our wonderful panel. It was a great discussion. Say thank you, and I also want to say thank you to LA CoMotion, because this is literally the only test bed for these ideas in the region. And so I appreciate you all being here and nesting these ideas within the kind of broader conversation, Greg. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you all for coming. We're now at break for the next 25 minutes or so. So please, in these last few moments of daylight,